All right, so I want to welcome everyone. We have Joshua Rothman with us. Joshua grew up in Staten Island in New York, and he received his undergraduate education at Cornell University and earned his master's and doctoral degrees at the University of Virginia. He's taught history at the University of Alabama since 2000, specializing in the histories of slavery and the American South, and is currently chair of the Department of History. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks. It's good to be here. And thanks to you for setting this up, and to the JCC for having me, and to everybody on the Zoom for taking a few minutes to hear about this book. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone, I've got a PowerPoint that'll go along with the talk. And can everyone see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna take maybe half an hour or so to tell you about the book that was published in April, which, as you can see on the screen, was called The Ledger and the Chain: How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. And in brief, the book is a history of the domestic slave trading firm of Franklin and Armfield. Between 1828 and 1836, when the company was most active in the slave trade, it bought enslaved people from slaveholders in Maryland and Virginia, shipped them by sea along the Atlantic coast, or walked them hundreds of miles across the continent, and sold them mostly to cotton and sugar planters and to merchants in Mississippi and Louisiana. All told, the company was responsible for the long-distance forced migration of 8,000 to 10,000 enslaved people. And that made it the largest domestic slave trading operation of its time, and probably the largest in American history. And what I argue in the book is that it was definitely the most important slave trading company in American history. And that was because the methods that it used, the volume it entailed, the money and the credit that it kept in circulation pushed ahead a transformation of the slave trade. They turned it from something that white men did mostly on a small scale as a temporary means of making extra cash into a profession, an ongoing concern, a big business, something that was integrated into national and global commodity and financial markets, something that had the potential for enormous profits, and of course, something that had devastating consequences for the enslaved. Now, the book uses a biographical approach to tell this story. It centers on the lives and careers of the three main partners in the company. And those were Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Wright Ballard. But the larger story that is traceable through the arcs of those lives and their careers is, in fact, the long and hideous history of the slave trade itself. Now, I think pretty often when people think about the domestic slave trade at all, they don't really think about it as something that has a life cycle, or something that even really has a history to it at all. What I mean by that is, of course, everyone who is familiar with the trade understands that the trade is a thing of the past, that it's something that played an important role in the historical development of the United States and in the lives of the people who were trafficked in the trade. But we don't often consider that the trade itself was not static. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't steady over time. The slave trade had a birth, it had a death, it ebbed and flowed and moved. Its rhythms and its size, they fluctuated over the course of many decades in conjunction with the economic, political, and physical landscape of the United States. And so it's the weaving together of the biographies of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard with the biography of the slave trade. That's what I'm trying to ultimately accomplish with the book. And that's what I want to try to spend some time outlining for you this morning. And as is the case with most life stories, it makes the most sense to begin at the beginning. Now, the trade in enslaved people in the United States is as old as the United States itself. In fact, it predated the United States itself. Africans and their descendants were bought and sold in mainland North America from the moment they were first imported to Virginia in the early 17th century. And tens of thousands of people were taken into the domestic slave trade in the colonial era and the early decades of the New Republic. But to the extent that we're able to trace it, it seems like that internal slave trade was limited, at least what it would be relative to what it would later become. And opportunities for slave traders were even more limited. And that was because through and after the American Revolution, slaveholders in places like South Carolina and Georgia, they met many of their labor demands by importing enslaved people from Africa and from the Caribbean. White migrants to new Western territories and states, places like Kentucky and Tennessee, they tended to bring enslaved laborers with them when they moved. And the truth was, the American banking system in this period was immature. It was undercapitalized. And so it was obviously possible to be a slave trader in the 18th century. But through the 18th century and into the early 19th century, large professional slave trading businesses were almost unheard of. So those circumstances really started to change in the decade or two after the closing of the legal transatlantic slave trade. Congress outlawed that trade in 1808, but Congress did nothing to limit the domestic traffic in enslaved people. And so the overseas ban actually effectively created a protected and federally sanctioned market for the slave trade within the boundaries of the United States. And it did so precisely at a moment when labor demands were skyrocketing in the lower South. That was the part of the country where the nation was expanding into portions of the continent acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. Military and diplomatic victories over the British and numerous Indian nations during the War of 1812 provided security and market access for white farmers who saw economic possibilities in burgeoning cotton and sugar markets. And so all of that made economic opportunities for slave traders. The number of enslaved people moved across state lines jumped by 80% between the 1800s and the 1810s. It grew by another 25% between the 1810s and the 1820s. All told, in the first 30 years of the 19th century, nearly 350,000 enslaved people suffered forced migration in what historian Ira Berlin famously called a second Middle Passage. Roughly 80% of those people, more than 275,000 in total, were taken out of Maryland and Virginia, where a declining tobacco economy left slaveholders with so-called surplus laborers who they put on the market for sale, and where a growing cadre of professional slave traders purchased them for transport, mostly to Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Now, this is the era where the main characters in my book come onto the stage. This is the era when Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard all entered the slave trade business. Isaac Franklin was first, traveling from his native Tennessee through the mountains to the Chesapeake. Franklin was just a teenager in 1808, but he was already working alongside his older brothers, bringing enslaved people over the Chesapeake, over the Appalachians rather, putting them on flatboats, sending them down the Mississippi River to places like Natchez and New Orleans for sale. Now, Franklin's older brothers mostly left the slave trade after the War of 1812, but Isaac Franklin himself actually threw himself further into it. By the early 1820s, he was a well-established businessman in Natchez. He was well known to slaveholders in Maryland and Northern Virginia. Now, John Armfield, who was a native of North Carolina, and Rice Ballard, who was native to Virginia, both of them were younger than Isaac Franklin, And neither of them started getting into the slave trade until the 1820s. John Armfield turned to it after a brief stint running a mercantile business. Rice Ballard got recruited into it by a wealthy patron who was looking for someplace to put sort of extra money to work. But both Armfield and Ballard took to the slave trade business quickly. They liked it. They liked the hustle. They liked the violence. And they determined that there was enough money to be made such that they decided to devote their entire careers to it. Now, like most of the people who joined what might be called this first generation of professional slave traders in the United States, Franklin Armfield and Ballard were working in an industry whose cruelty was boundless, whose numbers of players were expanding, but it was an industry that was still pretty haphazard. Chesapeake slave traders in the early 19th century tended to be itinerants. They often worked alone. They operated out of bars, taverns, hotels. They might put a newspaper advertisement announcing that they wanted to purchase as many as several dozen enslaved people at a time. They left town when they had the people they wanted, and they might show up again months later, or you might never see them again. They mostly marched people by land, chained into caravans known as coffles, maybe by a flatboat down a river. And when slave traders got to a market where they intended to make sales, they similarly found temporary locations, places where buyers could find them, places where they could stash the Black people they brought with them. And then they sold whoever they could, ideally for cash, and then they left. They were gone again. Now, Franklin Armfield and Ballard were all somewhat steadier than that. All three of them returned to the same markets year after year after year in the middle of the 1820s. Isaac Franklin had a regular sales location that he had set up in Natchez. But still, all three of them were mostly gathering people for sale by working in taverns, hanging out at estate sales and sheriff's auctions, following rumors about slaveholders in the countryside who had financial problems that might be eased or solved by selling enslaved people. Now, Franklin and Armfield first met in 1824. They got to know each other a little bit in the course of doing business. And in 1828, they decided to join forces. They pooled their money, they created a partnership, and they decided to go into the slave trading business together. And they went big right from the beginning. Between them, they staked what was basically the equivalent today of about $500,000 between them. A few years later, they brought Rice Ballard on as a third partner, and Ballard put up a similarly sized stake. And the company that the three of them built together marked the next stage in the evolution of America's domestic slave trade. And arguably, it was the most significant step in that evolution. Now, there were a number of elements that set the company known as Franklin and Armfield apart from most of the slave trading businesses that preceded it. So first, instead of working in a bar or a tavern, they established regular places of business, places that served as a headquarters, an office, and a slave pen all at once. John Armfield worked out of a 3-story townhouse with an attached walled compound in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. Rice Ballard worked out of a private jail in Richmond. And Franklin, with the help of one of his nephews, worked partially from his Natchez facility. And for a number of years, he also worked out of several locations that he rented in the city of New Orleans. Instead of running newspaper advertisements sporadically, John Armfield was in Alexandria all year round. He paid for advertisements that appeared in newspapers in Alexandria and elsewhere in the District of Columbia every single day. He let customers know that he was available to buy slaves, that he wanted to purchase large numbers of people, that he would pay higher cash prices for those people than any other slave trader in the market, and that he could be found in his office whenever anybody needed to find him. Instead of walking a few dozen enslaved people at a time over land or sending them by flatboat, Franklin and Armfield instead accumulated as many as several hundred people at a time. They had a small army of agents and sub-agents who spread the company's money around the Chesapeake and covered more ground and vastly expanded what Armfield or Ballard could possibly do by themselves. Those agents then brought people that they purchased to Alexandria or to Richmond. And from those cities, Armfield arranged to have most of them sent by ship, as many as 200 people at a time, down the Atlantic coast, around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, and up the mouth of the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And when those ships got to New Orleans, Isaac Franklin received them, sold some of those people in the city, and sent others farther upriver by steamboat to Natchez, where they would be sold there. When you added all of this up, this was a new kind of business. This was a business that was organized, steady, efficient, reliable for customers, and for the enslaved captives who were treated as merchandise, completely unrelenting, utterly pitiless. Now, it's worth pointing out that Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard did not invent these tactics themselves. There were a few other traders before them who'd innovated this new kind of slave trading operation. Most notable among them was a man named Austin Woolfolk. Now, Woolfolk, by the early 1820s, had a regular base of operations in Baltimore. He advertised widely. He oversaw a network of agents, and most of those agents were his relatives. Working primarily in Maryland, they accumulated enslaved people who were then shipped from Baltimore to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, there were other Woolfolk relatives who received and sold the enslaved from offices in that city. But within a few years of creating their company, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard bypassed Austin Woolfolk. They edged him aside. They cut so deeply into his business that Woolfolk started having to combat rumors that he had in fact died. Now, how'd they do it? Well, in part, they did it by doing everything Austin Woolfolk did, but bigger and better. The headquarters that John Armfield ran in Alexandria, for example, was massive. It took up more than half a city block. It became a kind of tourist attraction in its own right, particularly for anti-slavery activists who wanted to see and report on how slavery and the slave trade worked in the nation's capital. The network of agents Franklin and Armfield oversaw, meanwhile, was far more extensive than Austin Woolfolk's. Ultimately, their agents covered more than 20,000 square miles of Maryland and Virginia. And when it came to shipping, Franklin and Armfield became so big and so successful that in time they purchased 3 brigs of their own that comprised a company fleet. At the peak of Franklin and Armfield's operations in the middle of the 1830s, John Armfield was sending one of the company's ships to New Orleans filled with enslaved captives every 2 weeks. And he often supplemented company earnings by bringing things back, things like cotton and sugar and other items. He would bring those things on company boats back to the Chesapeake, back to cities in the north for delivery to local merchants. Now, some of what made Franklin Armfield and Ballard so successful was that they were very shrewd businessmen. They understood and they made no pretenses about the intimate brutalities that were necessary to make the slave trade work. They knew the trade had no room for sentimentality. It had no room for scruples. And that was particularly true when it came to the enslaved themselves. They understood that violence was endemic to stealing people away from their homes and forcing them to accept what was happening to them. They understood that all that really mattered for their business was whether an enslaved person could be sold for a profit. All three of the partners, in other words, were very good at calibrating their cruelty and assessing the market value of human beings. But they also understood the financial considerations that pertain to the slave trade. John Armfield had a knack for overseeing and coordinating the complicated logistics of purchasing and shipping the enslaved, and for providing dependability for customers. Isaac Franklin had a particular kind of genius for integrating enslaved people with money markets and credit flows. He understood that the stature of his company, the volume in which that company dealt, could provide access to borrowed capital that would pay off much more handsomely over the long haul than the quick cash sales that most slave traders looked for and relied on. And so what Franklin would do is he would establish credit lines with banks from New York to New Orleans. And by establishing those credit networks, he could sell slaves in the Lower South for commercial paper. He would then transmit that paper back east, where Armfield and Ballard turned it into cash and pumped it back into purchasing markets. All of this was a very intricate undertaking. It's a complicated business. But the better Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard became at handling both the violence and the money, the more solid their reputations became among customers, bankers, government officials, and the wide range of personnel that was required for their operation. And of course, the more solid their reputations became, the bigger those operations could get. But Franklin and Armfield didn't become a giant in the slave trading business just because company partners were clever entrepreneurs. They also were lucky to be working in the right place at the right time. The first 5 or 6 years of the 1830s saw the biggest economic boom the United States had seen to that point in its history. And the heart of that boom lay in the land, slave, and cotton economy of the Lower South. The white population of the Lower South increased by roughly 700,000 people in the 1830s. Increased nearly 1 million more in the 1830s. And it's encouraged by federal policies that forced Indian nations off the best cotton land on the continent. It was encouraged by banks that flooded the region with easy credit and cheap loans. And it was encouraged by cotton prices that nearly doubled between 1830 and 1835 alone. When all of that happened, demand for slaves skyrocketed accordingly, and so did profits for slave traders. In the 1830s, slave traders moved about as many people via the interstate slave trade as they had during the 1810s and the 1820s put together. The number of people trafficked in the trade jumped by 85% from the 1820s to the 1830s. One scholar has calculated slave trader profit margins in the early to mid 1830s as ranging from 30 to 50%. That was greater than at any other time before, other than a very brief moment in the late 1810s. And it was more than would ever be seen again before the Civil War. So in other words, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard, they might have done well in the slave trade whenever they started their business. They had talent, but they also sat on top of larger, deeper structural changes that served their interests perfectly. Given the raging demand for enslaved people and the widespread availability of banking capital, they could not have possibly done better than to have founded their company precisely when they did. And they couldn't have chosen a better time to shut it down than when they did either. For a variety of reasons, the company wound operations down in 1836, just months before the slave trade took another dramatic turn in its life cycle. The boom economy of the 1830s was a mirage. It was a debt-fueled bubble economy. And when it came crashing down in the spring of 1837, it took the slave trading business with it, ravaging it as it did most forms of commerce that depended on the currents of credit flowing around the world. Now, enslaved people suffered no matter what the economic circumstances of white people were. Thousands of enslaved people were sold to stave off bankruptcies during the Depression. But the slave trade itself actually dropped by 35% from the 1830s to the 1840s. And that drop probably disguises what was even a steeper decline from the late 1830s to the early 1840s alone. And that was true because as the nation recovered from its economic debacle by the middle of the 1840s, the slave trade took off again. Now, it never quite took the explosive shape that it had in the first half of the 1830s. But slaveholders didn't actually learn anything from the disaster that was the Panic of 1837. Instead, as the slaveholding portions of the United States expanded into new places like Texas, Arkansas, Florida, as slaveholders brought previously undeveloped regions of Louisiana and Mississippi into cultivation, demand for enslaved people took off again. In fact, white Southerners were so bullish about slavery's future, about the prospect of extending American sovereignty into places like Cuba and Central America, that slave prices usually rose and fell with the price of cotton. You could usually track them pretty cleanly. But in the 1850s, they became delinked from cotton prices. They just shot upward. And as more and more slave traders jumped to capitalize on this seemingly irrational, yet also seemingly boundless demand, the number of enslaved people trafficked across state lines jumped again by 35% in the 1850s. It reached nearly 250,000 people in that decade alone. That was nearly as many people as had been trafficked in the 1830s, and it brought the total number of enslaved people who were caught up in the forced migrations of the 19th century to more than 1 million people in total. And yet, even as the slave trade boomed again, even as thousands of men decided to try their hand at the slave trade business, even as new technologies, things like the railroad and the telegraph, they changed some things about how the business worked. They enabled the slave trade to spread deep into interior markets that had once been pretty isolated. The company model that was established by Isaac Franklin, Rice Ballard, and John Armfield, that remained the basic template for the slave trade. Now, by the 1850s, there were more large companies than there had been when Franklin and Armfield was the colossus of the trade. But nearly all of them worked the way Franklin and Armfield had worked. Established headquarters in cities, regular advertising, reliance on shipping or rail travel, supplies provided by agents who worked on salary or on commission, and integration with sprawling credit and banking systems. Now, sometimes these new companies functioned that way because the men who led them had actually been associated with Franklin and Armfield. There's a kind of slave trading business diaspora that's rooted in this particular company. But mostly the companies took that form because Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard had shown that that business model worked. They may have personally left the business by the late 1830s, but they were collecting debts from customers and bringing in revenues for years after that. All three of them ended up extravagantly wealthy and widely respected men. Now, of course, one of the ironies of their success and the successes of the men who followed them was that the more the slave trade ballooned, the more it fed anti-slavery agitation against it. And that agitation would, in time, help bring about the final stage in the life of the slave trade, which was, of course, its demolition during the Civil War. And that demolition began, appropriately enough, in Alexandria, where in May 1861, Union forces liberated the slave pen that had been John Armfield's headquarters. After confiscating it from Confederate cavalry who'd taken it over, the Union began using the facility as a prison for deserting, drunken, or insubordinate Union soldiers, for a few Confederate prisoners. And then near the end of the war, the Union converted the facility into portions of a hospital and to housing for a small number of freed people. But it was still a few years after 1861 before the domestic slave trade in the United States ended for good and was finally put to the end that it had long deserved. White Southerners clung to slavery to the very, very end. Slave traders offered people for sale to the very end. There was a market in enslaved people inside the Confederacy, even as slavery itself collapsed, even as Confederate currency inflated to the point where it was practically useless. When the Union finally liberated Richmond in April 1865, they had to track down a slave trader who had chained the slaves still in his jail together and was trying to march them out of town in the hopes of selling them someplace else. Because he figured even in its death throes, the slave trade would find a market somewhere. Now, I don't want to end by leaving you with the impression that the domestic slave trade was only a Southern phenomenon. I mean, I've sort of alluded to this already, but the slave trade was something that was sanctioned by the federal government. It involved banks from all over the country. The cotton and the sugar produced by enslaved people who were trafficked in the slave trade sat at the center of national and global economies. And the profits that were spun off of the asset values and the labor values of the enslaved, that money circulated throughout the United States. And of course, the trauma, the dislocation, the fear of the slave trade, those things shaped the lives of Black people in the United States, no matter where they lived. So the slave trade may have happened in the South, but in truth, the domestic slave trade and its consequences, they were everywhere. And in some ways, they still are. And slave traders like Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, they were just some of the men who made that so. I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. I'm happy to discuss anything that you want to talk about this. And thank you for listening.
So feel free to unmute yourself if you're muted, if you have some questions or comments that you'd like to offer. I'm curious how much of these locations and places have been preserved for historical purposes, and in what way that's done in a sensitive manner.
So the short answer is that a lot of the built environment of the slave trade, and particularly of Franklin and Armfield in the slave trade, hasn't survived. right? Rice Ballard slave jail in Richmond hasn't survived. The facilities at the forks of the road in Natchez have not survived. But I showed the picture of what was Franklin and Armfield's headquarters. The townhouse is still there. It looks different from what it looked like before the Civil War, but it's still there. It for a long time was a variety of different things. Most recently, it was the headquarters of Northern Virginia Urban League. They had a small exhibit to the slave trade that they put together in the basement of the building. The building was, and sort of still is, in desperate need of repair. The city of Alexandria put up about $2 million to buy the building. The state of Virginia has put in money to help rehab the building. And so that's being overhauled and turned into a much more substantial museum with a set of exhibits that's going to be there in Alexandria. They're hoping to reopen that in the fall. The Forks of the Road obviously is still there. The site is still there. The National Park Service has recently taken it over, and there's been an exhibit there that's mostly been put together by local activists and preservationists, but now the National Park Service is turning it into something more formalized under the auspices of the federal government. In New Orleans, there are, and only recently, but there are markers that denote sites of the slave trade, including one that was one of Franklin and Armfield's facilities. If you know that spot on Esplanade and Royal, just across from the French Quarter, it's technically in the Marigny. It's a parking lot. You may know that parking lot. That parking lot used to have a house on it with a compound that was a site of the slave trade for decades. Isaac Franklin rented it for a few years, but many traders operated it long after he was gone. So I mean, some of these sites have been, very few of them have been preserved, but more of them are starting to get recognized and marked so people know where they are. The sensitivity to it varies, but I think people are doing the best that they can. And I think a lot of that sort of commemoration of it is at least trending in the right direction in the last probably 10 or 15 years or so.
I wanted to thank you for your contribution to my education.
Thank you.
I can't believe it took me so long to learn this part of this story. And, I was a history teacher, but in the North, and I never heard any of this. So I feel grateful.
That you're welcome. And that is something that hearing that no longer surprises me. It did for a long time. It surprised me because it just seemed like, the domestic slave trade was enormous and it was everywhere in the United States before the Civil War. But for a long time, I still hear it sometimes when I would tell people what I was working on for this book, they would immediately ask me about Africa. And I had to make clear to them that I'm not talking about that slave trade, right? That's a slave trade everybody's heard about. But it was amazing to me how many people, they literally just didn't know a domestic slave trade existed. And once I explain it, you see a sort of light bulb go on, like, oh, of course, right? Of course, people were bought and sold in the country. But it's something that it wasn't taught really in schools for years. I mean, I think I gave a talk last week and somebody told me that it became part of, the state standards in Maryland in 2018. Before that, if you had a teacher that knew about it and taught it, okay. If not, you'd never learn about it. So, it's not surprising to hear that. And, but I'm glad that people I think are starting to learn about it more.
Excuse me, along those lines, have you investigated or are you aware of the teaching tools that the state of Louisiana is using? And I mean, I've read a couple things that are pretty horrific about what's in, I know, the Texas books.
Yeah.
And do you know what's being taught? And do you know if there's any organizations who are fighting to get better resources?
So I don't know the answer to the first part of that question because every state standards are going to be slightly different. Texas and California in particular have such outsized roles in the textbook market that textbook manufacturers often cater to those two states in particular. And those two states obviously are coming at these kinds of things from very different places. So that I'm sure that makes it very interesting for them. I don't know what the particular standards of Louisiana are, but I do know there are organizations like the Teaching Hard History Project, which is an offshoot of the Southern Poverty Law Center, that is holding workshops for teachers and has all sorts of kinds of curricular things that teachers can draw on. So there are organizations out there that offer curricular assistance to teachers, but I also know that this is a really difficult time for teachers who are teaching these subjects in public schools. These are matters that are, I don't think there's ever been a time where they're not political or politicized, because history is political and politicized. It doesn't really matter what you're teaching. All of it is inevitably political, because that, history isn't just sort of, well, this happened, this happened, this happened. You have to come up with explanations for why those things happen and what those, when those things happen, what kinds of changes happen. You need a narrative to fill in the facts. But yeah, I mean, I would encourage teachers who are sort of, able to bring these kinds of things into the classroom and looking for help to reach out to organizations like that for all sorts of curricular innovations, lesson plans, things like that. But the answer to the first part of the question is no, I don't know anything in particular about individual state standards. They're all sort of slightly different from each other. Yes, I see. Go ahead.
I was wondering how you get your book on the shelves in Montgomery at the museum that has.
That's a good question. It might be there. I don't know what bookstores and what institutions are carrying it. I mean, I know a lot of the museums in Alexandria are carrying it because they told me. I know people who've picked it up at Barnes and Noble. I actually had somebody who saw it in an airport, and that's like an author's dream, right? To see their book. And I don't know why somebody would pick this book in particular up at an airport. It's not the light read that most people look for, but I was thrilled to see it there. And it might well be on the shelves at the EJI's museum. It certainly should be. I do work to a certain extent with the people at Teaching Hard History and the Southern Poverty Law Center. So they're based in Montgomery. I haven't been to the museum since the book has come out, but if it's not there, the next time I go, I'll find somebody to give a little poke to.
Good.
I'm sorry, Julie Cornwell, you had your hand up. I'm sorry, I don't know everybody's name yet.
I was just needed clarification as to whether or not the book was available at the present time. So.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, it came out in April. You can find it in probably plenty of bookstores. You can get it, Amazon, your local bookstore, wherever. Please buy as many copies as you can.
Right. It sounds wonderful. Yep.
I have a question. I had never, I loved what you said. This was so interesting. And mainly because of the big company that was formed to do slave trading. And for some reason, I always thought it was a small entrepreneurial type of operation with maybe one or two, and that they would, sell slaves, and then they not do it for a little bit, and then they would go back and do it. And I had no idea it was such an organized big company operation.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're learning.
Yeah.
So
well,
I don't know why but I've never heard that before.
Yeah. I mean, it's understandable because, I mean, look, it's sort of like a lot of industries, right? I mean, there are look, think about something like publishing, right? Publishing today, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of little independent publishers, but they don't publish most books. Most books are published by basically, there are like 3 publishers in the whole world now, right? There's like Penguin Random House, there's the Hachette Group. Like you go into a bookstore and you see like all these different imprints of books and you assume it's all different publishers. It's not different publishers. It's all the same publisher. The big giants of an industry have a disproportionate share of that industry. Now, the slave trade doesn't start like that. Like I said, early in the talk, early on in the slave trade, most of it operates just the way you described. Small time actors working in the trade for a year or two, then they get out and do something else with the money. And there are certainly plenty of men who still work that way into the 1850s and 1860s. But what starts to happen, and I think what I argue is that in part because of companies like Franklin and Armfield, is you get more and more of these large companies that are operating year round, moving hundreds and hundreds of people in the course of a year. If you look in, the New Orleans newspapers, for example, right? If you look in the newspapers in New Orleans in the 1810s, the 1820s, even into the 1830s, you'll see small numbers of advertisements for slave sales, right? You'll see slave traders saying, come to my office in such and such a place. But there are very, very few of them. In the 1810s and 20s, there are almost none, in fact. And that doesn't mean there are no slave traders. They just don't work that way. But pick up a New Orleans newspaper in the 1840s and 1850s, you're going to see every single day advertisements from slave traders. Sometimes, dozens of them, because all of a sudden they were everywhere and they're working in this sort of ongoing kind of business. So yeah, I mean, I think even people who know about the slave trade don't necessarily understand that, as you said, that there are these big companies that are sort of operating on an ongoing basis for years and years at a time.
Mhm.
So interesting. I really thank you for your book. I look forward to reading it.
Good. You're welcome. Thank you for that. Thank you for saying that.
Really a wonderful, interesting new take. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other
Mr.
questions?
Rothman,
Yes.
I'm Joe Carr, and I just wanted to ask, how would I go about getting a copy of that map that you had?
Which one?
Well, it looked like it was number of slaves per county.
Yeah, so that's a map that was, if I remember right, I think that's produced by the War Department. That's a map from 1860. And I'm just gonna Google this really quick, because you might be able to find it like on the Library of Congress website. And if you do that, it'll probably have a pretty good resolution. Let me see. Yeah, if you go to the Library of Congress, and you just type in, I'll put the link in the chat. And if you go to that, so that's it's compiled from the census. And yeah, so that's in 1861. I think it's made by the War Department. I'm just going to put it in here. And so you can find that map there. The resolution on it is probably pretty good. And I think you can order, you can certainly download it and get it printed, in a really good resolution. You might be able to even order prints from the Library of Congress.
I lived in southern New England and New York for a good while, and gradually began to see markers in really totally unexpected places.
Yeah.
That there was activity of one sort or another. But as somebody said earlier, the sense that I had about the level of activity remained minuscule until I ran into the Historic New Orleans collection here and other people that I'm currently working with in some volunteer capacities. And I certainly hope that this gets to be an integral part. And I'm sorry I missed the first half of your, so I'm going to go back and pick you up on the recording. But I think that as a community, we really need to generate a history. I've lived here for 40 some years now, and I remained appalled at the level of information that's available in an integrated and accessible fashion. Our public libraries are run by the parishes.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't want to buy something, they're just not going to buy it. We have a predominance, I would say, of powerful white men I'm not in the power clerk here, but it just is amazing to me how much they managed to choke off, getting information that embarrasses or distresses them. So, but thank you very much for what you've done.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Tell me the name
Yeah, I
of
mean,
your
I
book, by
think
the way.
that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tell me the name of your book.
It's called The Ledger and the Chain.
Oh, okay. Just like the lecture. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I think that to your point about, what kind of information is presented to the public, I think that what you described was true as well, even in New Orleans for a
Yeah.
really, really long time. I mean, markers to the slave trade themselves are really new.
Right.
There were a few prior to a couple of years ago, but really for the domestic slave trade, there was one, and like I said, there's now more of them. And I actually worked on, there's actually there's an app where you can download and do a walking tour of the domestic slave trade. If you just go to the App Store and just type in domestic slave trade New Orleans, you'll find it. And you can walk alongside it. It's got a narrative. I helped sort of put that together along with a lot of other people who were in the city. But before that, there was a marker to Solomon Northup that really only went up after 12 Years a Slave came out, the movie. And so that tells you how recent that was. And before that, the only marker was there's a marker in the quarter that is supposedly on the site of Pierre Maspero's tavern. It's in the wrong spot. Like that tells you how much information is out there. There's one marker on a wall. It's on a building across the street from the Omni. The Omni was the site of Maspero's tavern, but the marker is actually across the street. And so there's this building that's been making its money off of saying it was Maspero's tavern. It was not. But that for decades, that was the only marker to the slave trade in the city. So that has started to change in New Orleans, but outside the city, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we all know what particularly sort of northern Louisiana's politics are like, and that's reflected often in the kind of information that's presented. And I live in Alabama, so I'm not judging Louisiana's politics. They are what they are.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Julie?
Anyone else? Questions, comments? All right. Well, thank you so much. This
Thank
was
you.
really interesting and so relevant to us here in New Orleans, for anyone really to know more about our history. So thank you for being able to present this to us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your time.
Excellent. It's been really helpful.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right, everybody. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks to the JCC.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
very much.